Hello everyone, I'm your instructor Daniel Steele, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In this lecture, I'm going to give you a little bit of a bonus. This lecture will not be directly linked to any of the readings assigned to this class, but it's sort of a helpful background in giving you a different take on what health equity could mean from a different approach, in this case, a liberal perspective. So, from a liberal perspective, health equity is mostly going to be linked to things like economic issues and the relationship between health and income, or health and wealth. And this is important because from a left liberal perspective, remember the right liberals tend to be more like libertarians who are really just focused on negative freedom, that is, the government leaves people alone, doesn't interfere with people's lives, whereas left liberals tend to be concerned as well with positive freedom, that is, with people's ability to access substantive opportunities like employment, education, healthcare, etc., and the idea that positive freedom is very important and it often depends on actions of the government to make sure that the playing field is leveled, and so everyone can have access to some good sort of level of education, healthcare, and so on. And so one of the most common ways to, common types of observations in approaching health equity from this perspective is the observation that in societies around the world, you will find a correlation between wealth or income or socioeconomic status and people's health. So this is data from the United Kingdom, and it's showing here cancer and cardiovascular disease rates by levels of deprivation. So this is basically going from left to right. You've got people who are essentially lower income, lower socioeconomic status to people who are higher. And you see that the rate of cancer and cardiovascular disease declines with each decile. Interestingly, there's not some sort of sufficient level where you sort of like you get to level 6 and then it just flattens out. It's actually declining all the way across. And that's a very common pattern you'll find in many societies. In a couple slides down, I'll show you that you see this pattern in Canada as well. So one interesting thing, though, is if you compare this health-wealth relationship across countries, and I note this is a comparison that was made a number of times in the readings by Powers and Faden, you find that the relationship between health and wealth is a bit different, because there is a relationship. The wealthier countries tend to be healthier than poorer countries, but there's a sort of threshold. Once you get to a certain threshold of wealth, more wealth doesn't make much more difference to health. So for instance, so here you see that there's this big increase in health at the very low income levels. As you increase from 0 to say 5,000, you're getting this big increase in lifespan, life expectancy. But once you get to around 10,000, it doesn't really make that much difference anymore. And you have countries, say like the USA, is a bit lower even than some countries that have much lower income, like it's like Costa Rica over here. So that suggests the phenomenon across countries is actually different than within countries. Here's one more example of within-country data relating wealth or income to health. And again, this one's from Canada, and this is about expected life, remaining years of life at age 25. So here, this is like at the lowest income level, you see that at age 25, you got maybe 48 years compared to the highest level, you got, maybe like 55 years of life. So it's, nearly a decade in difference in life expectancy at age 25. And again, you see that this carries all the way across the spectrum of income. It's not as if somehow there's a threshold and it flattens out at some point. It just keeps going up. And that's an interesting thing we'll talk about, and this is the difference between sort of absolute versus relative health impacts of inequalities. And that's something we'll talk about in class. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about today in this lecture is about a very influential theory from liberal philosophy about what a just society is. And this is a theory from John Rawls, who was a philosopher who lived mainly in the 20th century. He died in 2002, so he just made it into the 21st century, but lived almost all of his life in the 20th century, and is famous for developing a theory of justice that gives this picture of what an ideal, just, liberal democracy would be like. And the key sort of motivating idea in this theory is something called the original position. And the original position is a situation, not a real situation, a sort of hypothetical, imaginary situation in which people are unaware of the actual role they have in society. They don't know their gender, they don't know their religion, they don't know what their profession is, they don't know their social class, they don't know how much money they have, any of these things. And behind this veil of ignorance, they're required to decide on rules that will govern society. So in other words, the idea is when the veil is lifted, they'll have to walk into the society and behave according to these principles, live in the society that's governed by these principles that they have chosen. And Rawls's idea was that the rules that people would choose the rules that rational people would choose behind this veil of ignorance would be fair, because those rules could not be chosen to sort of provide special benefits to themselves or to their family or to their own ethnic group or whatever, because they wouldn't know which group they happen to belong to. So Rawls thought that people in the original position would choose these principles. The first one we've already encountered. This is the principle of equal liberty that says that each person has the right to the most extensive liberties compatible with similar liberties for all. As we discussed earlier, this is a principle that can be used to restrict the rights of some people to behave in ways, even if their behaviors don't directly harm other people. So one of Rawls's examples was restricting the freedom of people to donate money to political campaigns. The idea being that if there's no restrictions on how much money people can donate to political campaigns, then the wealthy people will just end up completely dominating the political process, and as a result, you'll no longer have equal political liberties. Another example like that would be education. If only wealthy people can access quality education, then that's going to limit the ability of other people to participate in the political process as well. And so a key thing to see here about the first principle in Rawls's scheme is that it's really concerned with political rights and political freedoms, not with other kinds of rights that people might have, such as a right to healthcare or something. This is a principle about political liberties like the right to free speech, the right not to be imprisoned without being formally accused of a crime, and so on. In addition to that, to the principle of equal liberty, though, Rawls had these two principles, the difference principle and the equal opportunity principle, that were about social and economic inequalities. And these stated that any social and economic inequalities should be arranged so that they are both A, and this is the difference principle, to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged persons, and B, attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of equality of opportunity. So the idea here is that sometimes a certain amount of inequality can be beneficial. To see the idea, imagine everybody got paid the same amount of money no matter what job they did. In such a world, people would have no real incentive to, for example, spend many years and a great deal of effort going, for instance, to get a medical degree. I mean, that's a lot of hard work, and if you don't get paid anymore, it's not clear you've got a real incentive to do it. Why not just, get a job straight out of college and make the same amount of money, right? So some inequalities can result in the overall benefit because they give people incentive to acquire skills and to work hard and do things that will benefit society as a whole. However, Rawls argued that those inequalities should only be allowed to the extent that they benefit the least well off. As soon as the inequalities start to be sort of pushing down the situation of the least well off people, they have to stop. And so Rawls was therefore very concerned that societies be ready to redistribute wealth to benefit the least advantaged members of society. And obviously a healthcare system, as we'll talk about, would be one way that might happen. In addition, any inequalities would be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of equality of opportunity. This is clearly a criterion that would preclude things like racial discrimination or sexism in hiring and employment and education and so on. Okay. Now, Rawls himself was focused on economic and political fairness and did not talk about health. In fact, he assumed that the people who were meeting in the behind the veil of ignorance in the original position were all sort of healthy adults. And so he sort of just excluded that from the picture of his theory, and he just wanted to focus on economic and political fairness. However, since Rawls's times, some philosophers have considered what would Rawls's theory look like if you applied it to health? If you imagine you're in a situation where we're considering health as something that can vary as part of the theory, how would this work? So, and this is in a paper by Norman Daniels and colleagues called "Health and Inequality, or Why Justice is Good for Our Health." And the key idea in this paper is that a society that was built according to Rawls's principles would be one where you would have a very high degree of health equity. And why is that? If we sort of go through their principles, the ideas might be, ideas kind of go like this. So if we start with the equal liberty principle, if you think of equal political participation, that's going to have an effect on the politics. That's going to prevent things like wealthy people dominating the political system and therefore making decisions that shape, say, healthcare and public health that benefit themselves but don't benefit the broader population. So the equal liberty principle is really going to be a requirement that demands equal participation in the society, and that's going to make the decisions sort of better for the general public rather than just sort of catering to the needs of some elite wealthy class. The difference principle clearly is going to emphasize redistribution of wealth to support the needs that people have. And so, for example, one of those needs is going to be health. And so, publicly funded healthcare systems that provide universal access to healthcare would be something you'd expect to see under the difference principle. Similarly, you would expect to see a complete absence of discrimination in healthcare and access to healthcare and who can become a medical doctor or a nurse and so on. And so the idea is that all of these things would be sort of good for the health of society and good for public health. However, Rawls's theory has a number of criticisms. One has to do with the fact that it's an ideal theory. It provides this sort of abstract picture of a just society, but it doesn't really say much of anything about how to address specific justice issues. And for some of Rawls's critics, this is a really big issue. For Charles Mills, for example, who's pictured here, Rawls's theory just sort of fails to adequately address this question of how would this theory work in the United States, where Rawls lived his entire life, which is a society where clearly there is this deeply entrenched, history of racism. And it's just not clear how this picture of, this ideal, perfect society is supposed to ever come about. And given that Rawls has lived his whole life in the United States, that does seem like a pretty big omission. Finally, it can be helpful to contrast Rawls with utilitarianism. So one feature is that Rawls's difference principle is very prioritarian. It really prioritizes the least well-off, and it prioritizes them even in cases where helping the least well-off is not always the most efficient thing to do. So the difference principle has this real big emphasis on prioritizing least well-off. Utilitarianism will sometimes recommend directing resources to those with the greatest need, but not always, because it's not always the most efficient thing to do. So Rawls is definitely much more prioritarian than utilitarianism is. Another difference is that Rawls' theory is focused on fairness within states. He's sort of assuming these questions are being asked within a particular country, not globally. And his theory isn't intended for deciding what's fair globally on a global stage. After he wrote A Theory of Justice, he did write other works that address this question, but the theory that I described so far is not that theory. It's a different theory. And that contrasts with utilitarianism, which is a kind of theory without borders. It just says resources should be sent wherever they produce the most benefit, whether that's home or abroad, and it's just completely cosmopolitan. Okay, so this is just a quick introduction to Rawls and how someone might think of Rawls as being related to, Rawls's theory being related to health equity. Okay, bye-bye.